Thank you for joining us today on this webinar discussing Building a Grad Nation, Progress and Challenge in Raising High School Graduation Rates, a new report analyzing graduation rates across the U.S. from the class of 2019. Civic wrote this report in collaboration with the Everyone Graduates Center as part of the Grad Nation campaign with America's Promise Alliance and the Alliance for Excellent Education. The campaign is sustained by support from AT&T and the Allstate Foundation. We have a few logistical notes before we dive into the content. You notice we have both the chat box and a Q&A box. Please input general questions about America's Promise Alliance, Civic, the Everyone Graduates Center, or All4Ed into the chat. We'll also have a couple of staff members following along to share helpful links or notes. You're welcome to share reactions and use the chat as well throughout the conversation. If you have questions for presenters or panelists, please submit those using the Q&A box. Now that we've taken care of logistics, we want to walk you through the session. Our session today has already begun with a brief welcome, and in a minute we'll turn to John Bridgeland and Bob Balfans, who will lead us through a data presentation to understand the 2019 graduation rate data. Following that, we'll be joined by a panel of 2 state leaders and 3 young people who will continue their own connect their own experiences to data and make connections between these data and the current COVID context. We'll conclude with a brief moderated Q&A and a final closing. So let's dig into the data and then discuss implications for the field. I'd like to now welcome John Bridgeland, the founder and CEO of Civic, and Bob Balfans, the director of the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins University.
Thank you, Liz, and all the extraordinary people on this Zoom. You know, it gives us hope that to see this community that has worked together over the last literally 15 to 20 years across politics and needless divisions to help so many young people in the schools they enter. So I actually want to just take a minute to thank a few people, to AT&T, to Randall, Charlene, Laura, Kathy, Myleta, Kellum, and Jessica for their extraordinary and long-term commitment over more than 15 years, providing $600 million to programs that help millions of students, particularly those in underserved communities. To Allstate, to Tom, Francie, and Laura, and to Chi Kim at Pure Edge, both of which gave tremendous energy around social and emotional learning, service learning, and to Jamie, Courtney, and Frank at the Lumina Foundation for their focus on that second goal of the Grad Nation campaign, high quality post-secondary credentials. And to the team at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Pat, Michael, Deb, Stephanie, their American Graduate Initiative, and Paths to the Future across the PBS NewsHour, NPR, and all their affiliates to lift up these efforts across the country. To Tricia, Jeff, Zoe, and Casey at Rakes, and Barbara at Schoolhouse Connection for Education Leads Home to help the country focus like a laser on helping students experiencing homelessness. And to the extraordinary teams at America's Promise, Monica, Liz, Melissa, the whole team, Alliance for Excellent Education led by Deb, Everyone Graduates Center, and our own Civic team with Matt and Ellie for this focused effort over decades that transcends political cycles. I'd especially like to thank my dear friend and a force for good, Bob Balfans, for our partnership over almost 20 years, and to dedicate this effort this year to the extraordinary Roger Weisberg, whose 40 years of helping kids lives on. Next slide, Liz. So this year's update is based on the latest data for the class of 2019 and serves as our last pre-COVID-19 baseline. Although there's not official data on high school graduation rates in what we'll call the COVID period, we know COVID-19's had a pretty significant impact on other important metrics. So it's highlighted in the report and worth mentioning here. After a brief ray of hope from a Brookings study, we've seen that math and reading scores are actually declining across grade levels, including declines in scores on 8th grade math, NAPE exams in most states. We're seeing lower rates of student engagement. This won't be a surprise to most of you, with increasing chronic absenteeism, which, as you all know, is a key early warning indicator and a sign of students being off track and can lead to dropout. Immediate college enrollment, unfortunately, is down. The pandemic also has negative effects on students' social and emotional health, particularly with historically marginalized subgroups, the most affected. And a recent CDC study, with whom we've been working closely, found that about 1,800 schools actually closed over the last year because and because COVID cases were detected and affected the education and well-being of nearly 1 million students. Also, nearly 60,000 teachers across 44 states were also affected by closures, mostly in the South. Neuroscientists tell us that children have a social gait to learning. Remember Patricia Wohl from the University of Washington, that was our lead panelist at our National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, and how much personal interaction matters. So we'll have to watch carefully the effects of remote learning. Next slide, Liz. So after 30 years of flatlining high school graduation rates, we've seen graduation rates rise from about 71% in 2001 to nearly 86% by the class of 19, 1 year before our class of 2020 goal. Remember, we all set that goal, and the governor set the goal, and the president set the goal of a 90% high school graduation rate by the class of 2020. We should have that data in 2022, 2023, and we'll know for sure how we're doing. That means that thanks to the efforts of all the extraordinary people on this Zoom and students, those who were experiencing difficulty staying in school, who gave us their insights on what would matter, to the teachers who work so hard every day, the principals and superintendents, the governors who've been heroic in keeping this on the national radar screen, that 4.5 million more students have graduated over the last 20 years rather than dropping out, which huge effects to them, our society, and our economy. So this is a little shoot of hope in an otherwise difficult national landscape. Next slide. We've also seen encouragingly that it's been a story of equity. The national average rate of increase just over the last 10 years has been 6.8 percentage points. But Black students have doubled that rate with 12.6 percentage point gain. Hispanic students, 81.7%, a 10 percentage point gain. And low income students, encouragingly, have crossed that magical 80% threshold for the first time with a 10 percentage point gain since 2011. They've also, Black and Hispanic students have led the way in doubling or more than doubling college enrollment. Now with the COVID period, college enrollment is down, so we'll have to see what effect it has and what the distribution is on equity. But these have been really encouraging trends because America's Promise and all of us have been committed to a pathway of equity. Next slide. We've also been focusing like a laser on those students who are disproportionately have the lowest graduation rates in the nation. Again, thanks to the Rakes Foundation, Schoolhouse Connection, and groups across the country, we've forged a partnership to focus like a laser on those students who were hidden in plain sight, students who experience homelessness. And the Education Leads Home campaign has been an important part of this effort. They have the lowest graduation rates in the country, and there are about 1.3 million students experiencing homelessness every year. And we know those numbers have grown during COVID. Also, students with disabilities. This is an area Bob and I have talked about, really merits a deeper study because states and local school districts in their policies and practices treat students with disabilities differently. So this is one number. We know it's low. We've never had full confidence in the actual number here because there's just so much, there's different treatment across states and grad rates for students with disabilities, but that's a very low rate. And that's an area that needs a lot more focus and energy. And finally, thanks to the Lumina Foundation, we actually did a deeper study this year on English language learners, immigrants, and also American Indian students and communities. And English learners are at 69%, which of course is well below the rates of graduation for other subgroups. Next slide. Thanks, Liz. So we focus there's nothing like a powerful goal, a civic marshal plan of action to meet it, quality implementation, and accountability for results. And when the governors came together 15 years ago on a graduation rate compact, all 50 governors signed, it was a sea change really in terms of the nation's focus like a laser on a galvanizing goal. And we've been focused too on making sure that gets achieved with equity. Bob and I like to joke that, when you look at the national picture, it only takes less than 2 Ohio State football game stadium of students to graduate, to reach the 90% high school graduation rate for the class of 2020, or so 160,000 more students nationally. When you break that down by states, it's actually very manageable and very actionable. To achieve that with equity, though, we need 61,000 more Black students graduating, 81,000 Hispanic, 102,000 students with disabilities, and 59,000 English learners to be on track for 90% for those populations. Next slide. And that's the national picture, but this report every year goes deeper into each state. And over to the wonderful Bob Balfance. Bob.
Thank you, Bridge. And really what we want to focus on now is where do we go from here? Where do we go from a story of sustained progress over the last 15 years, gap closing, still some challenges, right? You could see we weren't quite on pace pre-pandemic to get to 90% by 2020, though made good progress towards it. But then, of course, we had a pandemic. And as Bridge was showing in some of that data, right, the very communities that drove the graduation rate gains over the past 15 years, low income and minority communities, are the very communities that were hit hardest by the pandemic, right? And therefore, many of those gains are at risk, right? We have to really look at that with cold, steely eyes and open minds on how to solve it, right? And so when we thought about this, what we really thought it was important to highlight in this report, and really making that pivot from pre-pandemic data to how do we keep improving graduation rates and college or career readiness despite the impacts of the pandemic, is that realization that each state now in some ways is its own story, right? We know there were some things that drove improvement over that time, and those things still need to continue, like redesigning high schools, the use of on-track and early warning systems, aligning high school course of study with the requirements of state university systems. All that needs to continue full force. But also we became aware that in addition to that, each state has some unique challenges. And to highlight that, if we go to the next slide, we created for this report, a series of state level data profiles we're calling meeting the moment data profiles. We really encourage you to check these out for your state and to share them with policymakers and community leaders and parents and school folks, because they really help point to where does your state have to focus its energies to make sure that through the pandemic and beyond, it can graduate all of its students ready for post-secondary success and ultimately adult success. And really that's what our public education system has to do, right? It has to prepare the next generation to become successful adults. In this data, you'll find trend data, you'll find gap closing data, you'll find data on where are the non-graduates coming from, and we're going to see in a moment that varies greatly by state. You'll also see some data on percent of kids with ACEs and percent of kids chronically absent, sort of showing some of the conditions. And finally, how concentrated is the problem? Where is it located in a few places or spread more broadly? So let's dig into that a little bit now. And we go one more slide. So in many states, at least half the challenges become highly concentrated. And really, if you look at this chart, the sort of darkest color are states where half the non-graduates, remaining non-graduate, kids are not graduating on time, can be found in 10 or fewer school districts in those states. The green states are the ones where it's a little more spread out across 20 or more districts, in some cases 40 or 50 districts. But we have to remember that there are over 12,000 school districts in the United States. Yet in most states, where the greatest number of kids are still not graduating is in a relatively small number of places, which helps us concentrate and target our efforts. We go to the next slide. When we aggregate across the whole nation, we find, in fact, that 50% of non-grads or kids sort of, you could say, colloquially falling off track to graduation are found in just 4% of districts, which is about 500 districts. And what's most interesting, though, when you look where these districts are, it sort of defies some of our stereotypes. And this is really important to help us understand where the problem really is, where the supports really need to be. So about a third of those districts are the large city districts that might be in our head of where dropouts have been concentrated. A greater number are actually suburban. A relatively large number are medium and small city. and a decent percentage of them are rural, right? So it's both a concentrated problem, but it's sort of spread throughout different locales. And then the next chart is most interesting. We looked at what is the wealth and the advantages of the larger community in which these districts are. If we go to the county level of where the school districts are, is it a place of poverty? Is it a place of affluence? And we find that yes, a good number of these are in disadvantaged areas where there is sort of community-wide under-resourced. They've been historically under-resourced at the community level. But we find that there is a third of them, more of them, that are actually located within more broadly advantaged communities, right? Sort of islands of poverty and seas of affluence. And that just, again, those are different challenges, right? Whether you're dealing with a very large sort of area of underinvestment and disadvantage, or small pockets of disadvantage in areas of affluence. So that's why it's important to know your state story, right? Where does it align with those possibilities? We go to the next slide. Another key thing where states are now differentiating themselves is when students are not graduating on time, where do we find them? Historically, right, we found those kids in our neighborhood high schools. And again, we can see in the darkest shade here, those states are still pretty traditional. 90% or more of their students that are not graduating on time are found in district neighborhood high schools. But if we look at sort of the purplish color, that's the other end of the spectrum. In those states, in places like Colorado, Arizona, California, Washington, Florida, Michigan, big states, less than 60% of the students not graduating in time are in neighborhood high schools, but whether they are in alternative schools, virtual schools, charter schools, schools that have that sort of is different challenge how to solve than perhaps your neighborhood high school. So again, that's important to understand in your state, where are students not graduating from, because that requires different solutions. Next slide. And this looks a little deeper, this alternative question, right? Because this is a real challenge. On one hand, alternative schools play a very important role, and there are some very good alternative schools. On the other hand, one could imagine overusing alternative schools, and it almost takes the pressure off the neighborhood high school. If kids are struggling, if maybe the program doesn't exactly fit them, rather than having to change the program or change the supports to make the kids succeed, you can say, well, we have a different school for you. We have this other school. You should, that'll fit you better. Go there. But then those alternative schools become, in themselves, overwhelm themselves with a very high concentration of students with many needs and perhaps not the resourcing to deal with it. So when we look now at a state like Colorado, almost there, right? Just where it is 40% of their non-grads are now found in alternative schools. That's a very different challenge for a state than a place like Georgia, where it's less than 10% are in alternative schools. So again, it's really important to say where our non-grads are coming from. One more thing to look at quickly is charter schools on the next slide. And here again, we see in some states about a quarter or more of the students not graduating time are found in charter schools. Now, partly this is because those states just have larger charter sectors, and that could be okay or even good. But the challenge sometimes is that charters often have a diversity of governance structures, a diversity of authorizers. Sometimes they're authorized by a district, sometimes they're authorized by the university, sometimes by the state, sometimes by all three. And that can make it a little more difficult to sort of have an organized accountability approach to make sure that they're getting all the supports they need and are focused on this as an important outcome to solve. Next slide. But one thing that's common across states, and we really want to highlight in this report in our discussion today, and this really popped out in the data this time, is really the growing disproportionality of students with disabilities among students that are still not graduating. With all the progress we've made, with all the spread of redesigning our high schools, with using early warning and on-track systems, with creating different student support systems, the students who really would benefit from that most, we somehow have not connected those supports to at the scale needed. And because of that, increasingly the students who are not graduating are students with disabilities. Yet we know that students with disabilities, the vast majority, nearly all of them, with the right supports, can graduate high school and succeed in post-secondary. And it's gotten to the point now where a growing number of states, those in purple, 40% or more of the students who are not graduating are students with disabilities. That's going to be 2 times, closer, sometimes 3 times the student population that's identified with having disabilities. So this is really an area where we really have to have increased focus and increased solutions, and really where effective ideas could be spread across many states to very good effect. Next slide. Two last points to shape our state level response. Another unfortunately common experience in most states pre-pandemic was high rates of chronic absenteeism. Now we know that one of the big impacts of the pandemic was increasing chronic absenteeism. It was hard for kids oftentimes to virtually, because they had to work or take care of siblings, to attend even virtual school on a regular basis. But the truth is, pre-pandemic, many students were not attending school on a regular basis. Again, the states in purple on this map, essentially a third of their students, high school students, were chronically absent, missing a month of school pre-pandemic, right? Which tells us that there really is a continued need for high school redesign, right? That somehow the high schools we have are not connecting with the lives and the needs of the students that go to them, to the extent that they are not able to attend them or choose not to attend them on a regular basis. And our last slide shows that, one place where actually states are diverging, and this is going to set up, again, sort of differences across state going forward, is in 8th grade NAPE scores. And we have found that 8th grade NAPE it does play a role in high school graduation. And it's pretty clear why, right? That if you come into high school more prepared, you're more likely to succeed in your classes, and you're more likely to be engaged in them. And you're more likely then to sort of stay on track. And what the data tells us is pre-pandemic, some states were doing better and some states were doing worse. And it was pretty much a half and half story. So again, that's a key situation for some cross-state learning, and a recognition that we just can't let this progress we've had slide, even in the face of a pandemic. We really have to take what we know works, customize a solution to the challenges of each state, and keep going, because there is no other option, right? Our public education system has to prepare our students to graduate ready for post-secondary success and successful adulthoods, or it just doesn't work for anybody. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to share their insights from the work in the school systems and going to them.
Thank you, Bridge and Bob, for that simple, succinct, straight to the point, strong call to action related to the 2019 graduation rate data. I've been doing this with you both for a few years now, and I'm always struck by how straightforward these problems are with the data, but also really humbled and excited about the progress. So on that note of progress, I'm really happy to welcome a really distinguished panel here from the state level and from the student level. You just heard from Bridge and Bob the national data, and if you go to the website, you'll see the state profiles. And across the board, what we've seen in this data is that the graduation rate for two particular groups of students, students with disabilities and English learners, has been slower to improve than other subgroup data. And we know, I think intuitively, that that makes sense. They have unique needs. It doesn't make sense that there's an equity gap, but we know that what those students need might be a little bit different, and tailoring that instruction and those supports is required. And states are doing this in all kinds of different ways. And also the experience of young people is really varied among those two student groups. So we've assembled a panel today that will share the experiences, joys, and struggles of working with and for young people who are students with disabilities or English learners. And so I hope they all have their cameras on now. We're going to start with Robin and Melissa. Robin is at the Mississippi Department of Education and works on programs at the state level to support districts in their work with students with disabilities. And Melissa Castillo is at the Arizona Department of Education and works on a range of programs in support of lots of students with unique needs, including English learners. So we're going to start with both of these state leaders. For both of you, your role in the state education agency puts in you responsibility for supporting districts on improving educational outcomes with equity, or put another way, for purposes of our time together, making sure that all opportunities are available to all young people in the education system, including students with disabilities and English learners. So I want to invite you both, and we can start with Robin, to share a little bit more about what you're leading in your state agencies for these populations.
So I'll talk a little bit about the strategies. I was hired in 2019 to be the director of the Office of Special Education, and my charge was to improve the supports and the outcomes for students with disabilities. So immediately we implemented an agency-wide initiative to improve those supports at the state level. We interviewed superintendents, special education directors, principals, teachers, and students, really to determine what they thought success looked like for students with disabilities and what they felt like would attribute to that success. So we began an initiative across the agency to collaborate internally within all the offices to focus on ensuring that the resources and the professional development that we developed at the state level intentionally embedded supports and resources for students with disabilities. So there was an intentional focus on those students when we were providing trainings and things like that. Immediately, I knew that we had been focusing and concentrating so much on compliance, and we needed to focus on academics. So we established an academic office, and that office supports students at achieving grade level standards. We wanted to ensure that we were collaborating with all of the offices, secondary, elementary, throughout the agency, teaching and leading, so that we could ensure that our special education teachers even had the supports they needed to deliver that content. We employed literacy coaches to support our schools that have been identified as low performing based on the performance and graduation rates of our students with disabilities. We offered professional development that's focused on the 5 components of reading, to all general ed and special education teachers, as well as administrators, because we felt like building that content knowledge was so important for them. We partnered with the Chief Council of State School Officers on advancing inclusive principal leadership initiative. And that's just a diverse group of stakeholders. We have special education directors. We have our institution of higher learning faculty on that. We have another a national partner, CEDAR, that is all the agency reps at the Department of Education. And our sole focus is with this project is to ensure that administrators have the resources, the PD, and the training needed to achieve inclusive environments that support all student success. We've done a lot of work within the agency to build the knowledge of all the departments of what inclusive environments look like, and to build a consistent understanding of the language that is needed to understand that. We also have partnered with CEDAR on our policy preparation and practice of our special education teachers to address recruitment and retention of special ed teachers. And really here we're focusing on policies and practices and that build the skill and content knowledge of our educators, because multiple surveys that have been conducted with CEDAR and with CCSSO reiterate that the teachers leave the practice because they don't feel they have the adequate support or the content knowledge to support our students with disabilities. We recently developed our SEL standards and are providing extensive training and resources to support the integration of the standards into the curriculum. We feel like COVID just was a mental drain on our teachers and our students, and we felt like this was the perfect time to invest our efforts in that initiative. We also have established blended pre-K classes, so we're offering grants for districts to develop blended pre-K classrooms. That's a combination of our general ed and special education students, and really working there on that early intervention piece. We know that's crucial. We've also established an Office of Professional Development, and we've hired professional development coordinators to support our districts with areas and topics that we determine are high need. One of the things I'll say here, just to plug, is when we develop IEPs for students with disabilities, what we know is if you don't have the skill and content knowledge, it's very difficult to develop really good, solid goals that are connected to the standards. So we feel like that was an area that our professional development coordinators could help support us with. We've really made it a priority to collaborate with general ed and special education teachers and focus on inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And what does that look like? Not just to say it, but what does it really look like in action for all students? And then we implemented the early warning system to address chronic absenteeism. We created a guide that provides some information on how to effectively use early warning data to identify, support, and monitor at-risk students in grades K through 12. And the last thing, we developed an AFA 2.0 guide to help teachers determine and implement supports for every student. It really provides practical classroom adaptations that can be implemented at any instructional level. It helps the teachers provide quality classroom instruction for all students who receive instruction in the general education setting, including early childhood, general education, gifted learners, English learners, and students with disabilities. So we've been busy. My charge was large when I took it on from Dr. Wright, our state superintendent. And so we've been busy. We had to make lots of changes, and that data that we saw was one of the reasons.
Robin, thank you so much. I know when we were prepping together, I remember thinking this feels like an overhaul in how a state education agency is supporting educators and district leaders. So thank you for sharing, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about it in the coming panel. Thanks. Melissa, I want to invite you in to share a little bit more about what you've been up to in Arizona with English learners. Thanks.
Sure. Well, thank you. Again, my name is Melissa Castillo, and I am joining you from the state of Arizona. I am the Associate Superintendent of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And like Robin, we've been extremely busy as well. And when I think about our biggest charge, or the biggest strategy that we're using in Arizona to move the needle when it comes to academic achievement for our English language learners, is that we really are just intensifying our efforts to support our LEAs in implementing current shifts in English learner policy and programs. So in 2019, we had ELA legislation that was passed and signed into law, which changed our minimum required daily minutes of English language development instruction. We are an English only state. We had legislation passed in 2001, which mandated that English learners had to spend 4 hours of their instructional day in English language development coursework, which really limited their access and opportunity to grade level content and learning alongside their native English speaking peers. In 2019, this legislation decreased that number to half of that time, which really opened up the opportunity for our students to have access to grade level content and to learn again alongside their native English speaking peers. This is especially important for our high school students, right, that are required to attain a certain amount of credits to graduate on time. So the expectation with us is that if we're truly moving forward and implementing our new policies around the amount of time that students have to spend in a certain type of instruction tied to English language acquisition, we are going to increase the chances that they're achieving and that they're doing so with appropriate content. Something that came with this as well is that it charged us at the Department of Education to identify the models that the State Board of Education would adopt and approved that our LEAs would then choose from. So in order for this to happen, we were charged with deciding what exactly those models would consist of, and what we wanted to ensure was at the foundation of the work that our LEAs, our charters, our districts were doing with our English language learner population. So from this, we developed what we call Arizona's language development approach. And the language development approach is a set of underlying assumptions about how we will develop language and literacy and learning in all subject areas for our English learners throughout a system. These assumptions are really our best thinking made explicit so that we can understand, plan, and implement appropriate English learner programs. It was co-created with educators across the state of Arizona. It included teachers, administrators, experts from our universities, and then we worked in partnership with West Ed. After doing a really deep dive and synthesis of the research around English learners and EL programs, we created what we call now, again, our Arizona language development approach. You can see that at the core of Arizona's language development approach is the agreed upon understanding that all individuals at every level within the educational system play a role in the education of our English learners and are responsible for ensuring the success and achievement of our over 80,000 multilingual learners who attend Arizona schools. This, although is something that we would assume is just a natural part of any program that's situated around any group of learners, was a huge shift in Arizona. For far too long, with the restrictions of the legislation that was passed in 2001, there were very small groups of educators that were deemed those responsible for the educational success of our English learners. And it was those educators that were responsible for teaching within the very restrictive mandates around our 4 hours of English language development. Now that that time has been decreased to only 2 hours, what happens now is that our English learners are spending the rest of the day in content classrooms with different teachers alongside their native English speaking peers. So we now all are responsible for ensuring that our English language learners are successful in school. So working from the inside out, you can see the 4 principles that reflect the research that we studied and the non-negotiable components of a comprehensive instructional program for Arizona's English learner students. Principle 1 is asset-based behaviors and expectations, which really makes certain that we value and leverage who our students are, what they bring to the school, and the community that they're a part of. Principle 2, which is focused on integrated instruction and disciplinary language and content, ensures that we use content and the language it's made up of as a vehicle to further develop a student's language in a relevant and meaningful way. Principle 3 is targeted and explicit language instruction, which really makes certain that our students are provided the opportunity they need to develop the English language skills that they'll need to access grade level content. And this time in an English language program is directly aligned to the English language proficiency standards, so that we're elevating their language acquisition so that they're successful as they move through the rest of their day in content area instruction that is made up of content language. And finally, principle 4 is focused on assessment, monitoring, and feedback, which makes certain that beyond our state assessment on language, that we are assessing and monitoring students' progress along the way, so that we are ensuring that they're moving down the appropriate trajectory with the skills they need in literacy as well as language to be successful in school. And what we ultimately hope is graduate and do so in a timely manner. From these 4 principles, we then identified the 4 research-based models that our LEAs could choose from for their English language learners to participate in. So we have a pull-out model, a 2-hour model, a newcomer model, which is our only model that allows for 4 hours of English language development to then prepare students to move into a 2-hour pull-out model. And then we're really excited that finally, it's been a long time since we in the state of Arizona have been able to offer a 50-50 dual language immersion model to all of our students across the state, including those that come to school speaking another language other than English as their first language. So for us, intensifying our efforts to provide guidance, support, and professional learning around Arizona's language development approach in our 4 identified models is really the strategy at the forefront of our work to support our LEAs in moving our English language learners forward.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I think so much of what you just shared is very exciting for students in Arizona. And I know that going from 4 hours to 2 hours is really just a huge win for young people. And I really thank you for your leadership in that big transition. I want to invite our 3 of our college students onto the screen. Cassidy, Malachi, and Ruby are all current college students and recent graduates from the American K-12 system. And so we're really excited to invite them first to introduce themselves more fully to the full group, to our audience, and then we will transition into a full panel discussion and bring Robin and Melissa back into the fold. So I just want to make sure, Cassidy, Malachi, and Ruby, that you have your cameras on and you can join.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yes, hi, Ruby. All right, so I'm gonna just give a little bit of a voiceover, and we might start with Ruby and then go to Cassidy and Malachi, so just so you're teed up. I just want to invite you to share a little bit more about yourself so we can know you fully. You know, what brings you joy? What are you doing right now in your life? Where did you go to high school? And any sort of top of mind reflections. I'm going to ask you to make this about 2 to 3 minutes, and then we're going to transition into the full panel discussion where we'll hear from you more. Ruby?
Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Ruby Marquez Tejas. I am from Oregon, Hillsborough to be exact. So I went to Hillsborough High School. I'm a daughter of immigrants, so English was not my first language. It was my second language. And a little bit about me, I enjoy the arts, particularly photography, film, editing, anything along the that line. So my major is, oh, well, let me start. Where do I go to school? I go to the University of Oregon. I am a senior, finishing up my last year, and I am studying advertising in Spanish with a minor in sports business. And based off that, my interests are the creative route as well as sports. Growing up, I grew up with 2 older brothers, and so I was the only girl in my family, and that forced me to really engage in like rough activities, which meant like playing soccer, basketball, riding a bike, falling, all of that. So yeah, I guess that's where I'll end because I love to talk and I will go over my 3 minutes.
Thanks, Ruby. Cassidy?
Hello, I'm Cassidy McClellan. I'm a sophomore elementary education major at the illustrious Alabama A&M University. I go to school in Alabama, but I'm originally from Toledo, Ohio, and I graduated from Toledo Early College in 2020. With my degree, I plan on being a teacher, then going into educational policy and leadership, and also a newfound interest of criminal justice. So I would like to study educational policy on the state and federal level, and I also would like to study the school to prison pipeline. And yeah, so and a fun fact about me is I like to bedazzle shoes.
Now the whole world knows. Thanks, Cassidy. I want Malachi.
Hi, I'm Malachi Pruitt. I'm a sophomore at Georgia State University. I went to elementary through high school in Atlanta suburb. Right now I'm majoring in history with a focus on pre-education, with my plan basically being to become a high school teacher. Additionally, I work with the National Center for Learning Disabilities on their Young Adult Leadership Council. Fun fact about me is I'm a massive nerd who plays D&D and Magic in my free time.
Thank you so much. So I am going to transition us to the panel, and I have an opening question really for Cassidy, Malachi, or Ruby. We've just heard from Bridge and Bob an analysis of the national data, and we shared with you the state profiles for the states where you went to high school and or where you're in college. What were your reactions to some of those high-level trends nationally and at the state level?
For me personally, I kind of started thinking about what that data would look like when I was in school. Since growing up, I never really paid attention to that. And now that I am in college, I've learned a little bit more about what our education system looks like now. In the past, I really thought it was perfect and great just because that's what all I knew, but I never took a second perspective. And now that I've learned and seen the different injustices that had occurred in the past, and like all the advocating and legislators that went through to really help people from low income backgrounds, minority groups, people like me, get the help they needed to really be successful. I'm really curious to see what it looks like when I was going through school and if that really reflects with my experience. And then now I'm still shocked that there still needs to be more and more like support. I think I assumed like by now we would have been at like a great level, like at a great point, but really with the pandemic, I think really at this critical point where we really need to act, or else we will go back to where we once were, and we don't want to get there. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Totally. Cassidy, yeah.
Looking at the data, I was a little bit disappointed with Ohio, just because in school we were kind of taught that like I didn't really expect the graduation rate to be so low. And my school culture was about winging out people. So we started off with 100 students, and by senior year we graduated with 50. And I honestly just thought that was an early college culture. But now looking at Ohio, it seems like it's an Ohio education culture. And it was just, I'm also, I have a learning disability. I have auditory processing. So, throughout high school, it was very hard for me to get my accommodations, get extra time on my test. And I didn't even receive extra time on my ACT to get into college. So just looking at that data, it was just a little bit frustrating. And as being an elementary education major, I always said like, oh, I don't want to go back to Ohio. I left, I'm in Alabama. I really like it. But looking at the graduation rates, I'm considering going back, because I feel like we really need to, the 82% wasn't enough. We really need to, get it higher, especially seeing that Alabama had a 91%. So I would just like to help out in that area.
For me, one of the big questions that came up was how cross sections impact students with disabilities. Given that we are already less likely to graduate from college, how does being a part of another disadvantaged group, Black, low income, English language learner, impact our graduation rates? Is it proportional, or does it basically do double damage and force the graduation rates even lower within those groups? Additionally, I went to a magnet school, and I'm fully aware that they basically exist to artificially inflate graduation rates and test scores by moving like high performing students into low performing schools. And I wonder how, if those didn't exist, the data would change, because they got a lot of funding and resources that perhaps could have been distributed to better impact those who are already struggling, as opposed to those of us who were already succeeding in the system, if that makes sense. And I think that it's important to do so in order to help to support those who are struggling, because there's a limited number of resources, and dedicating them to the students who are already at an advantage, who are already, getting above and ahead of their peers, seems to be a short-term solution for a long-term problem.
Stunning. I feel like we should all resign our positions and put you three in charge. Thank you for those really astute observations from the data. I do want to now, I think we're mindful that this is 2019 data, and we have yet to see precisely how COVID is going to impact the class of 2020 and the class of 2021. Putting that to the side for the moment, not anything super fundamental has probably changed from when you all were in high school and graduating, and the data that we are sharing today. When you look back on when you were in school and you've transitioned into post-secondary life, how do you reflect on your preparation for post-secondary life, college and otherwise, as you received it in the high school years? How did that prepare you or not for where you are now? I would like to actually start with Cassidy on this one.
So kind of like I mentioned, my high school culture was about winging out students. So we were, freshman and sophomore year, the first thing we had to do, we had to write a 10-page paper, turn it into a project, and do 15 annotations. So that was one of the things that they used to weed a lot of people out, and it also counted for 2 grades. So then if you don't do well on it, you basically fail out. So that was the culture that I experienced. And I feel like it kind of just pushed me away from, wanting to stay in Ohio. And I wanted to look for a college that really just was nurturing. So I feel like I was prepared as far as writing papers and doing things like that. But as far as like nurturing, I really wanted to go to a school that I felt nurtured. I felt like teachers had my back. I can go and ask questions, have a good advisor, ask for recommendations. So I feel like that's one thing that led me to Alabama, and that led me to my historically Black college, because while in the pandemic, my ACT wasn't as great as I wanted it to be. I didn't receive the score I wanted, and I didn't receive extended time. So my university's honors program, their ACT score was higher, but they lowered the score. So the scores didn't count. So I got accepted into the honors program, and my university gave me a lot of scholarships, way more than anybody else had given me. And I received scholarships from the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, which it was just very heartwarming for me, because I didn't do well on the standardized testing. And when you're applying to colleges, they have them on their websites, and it's like, oh, this GPA, this ACT, and I didn't meet the requirements for those. So I was just very grateful for my university and the Thurgood Marshall College Fund for just seeing something in me. So that was one thing that led me to Alabama. So as far as being prepared, I was kind of prepared because I was low-key bullied into, that was the culture of my high school, just weeding people out. So I had to do my work. I wasn't going to fail out of high school. And unfortunately, I've seen some students who have, and I just didn't want to do that. So I did my work. I stayed home. I didn't go anywhere. I worked really hard. So now I'm at a university that really cares for me and really nurtures me, and I have a good advisor and things like that. So that's one thing that led me to Alabama.
Thank you. It really shows how our experiences are a mixed bag, but the really important decisions shouldn't have to be quite that difficult. Ruby, I want to bring you in on this question about your high school years preparing you for where you are now.
Yeah, so for me, I think the way my high school was set up, it was predominantly Latinx. So for the most part of my high school career, I didn't feel other. It was very much like, oh, I belong here. So with that, I gained confidence to really go out there and find the resources I needed to be successful. But I do think there was a lack of support when it came to pushing you to the arts. A lot of my teachers would be like, oh, you should consider going into the STEM field, or think about this, because this is where like the money is at, and like that's where you're going to be the most successful. But when it came to that, a lot of the classes you had to take to be in the STEM field would be like biology, math, and I wasn't terrible at it, but I wasn't great. I'd struggled, and I knew that compared to my friend group, I was seen as the smart one, and they labeled themselves as not as smart, and so they would just discourage themselves from even trying. And because of that, I think a lot of my peers really just weeded themselves out. One, because they're like, oh, what's the point of me trying if, like, one, the teacher won't believe in me, but then at the same time, I don't fit this curriculum. And I think that's where I really wish my high school could have done more, and could have like promoted more of like the graphic design route, or photography, because I know a lot of my peers would have been successful in there. And standardized testing doesn't do a good job at like really outlining who is doing good and who is doing bad. Because keep in mind, my school was predominantly Latinx, and because of that, most of us were like English language learners. And so we were already learning a second language, and a lot of my peers were struggling to really pick up English. Even like we would get students who were just arriving to the US. And so it was a struggle. And I think if it weren't for me going out of my way to like stay after school and get the tutoring that I needed, I probably would have fell through the cracks as well.
Thanks so much, Ruby. Melissa and Robin, I want to bring you in and just invite any reactions to the student experiences you just heard, and sort of does it resonate? How does it land with you?
So I'd be happy to start it if that's okay. And I think to your point, Monica, where you said, I think these students could definitely take over the world for us and probably make it a much better place. And if any of them, when they are finished with their studies, would like to come to the state of Arizona to pursue their careers, please reach out to me. I think they would be wonderful role models. And really, in listening to their stories, it's always really inspiring and heartwarming, and also directly connects to the work that I strive to do every day, especially in this space around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Something that I'm really proud of in regards to the work that we're doing in Arizona and our language development approach is principle one, which is asset-based behaviors and expectations, which I think really speaks to some of what was shared in regards to valuing who our learners are, ensuring that we understand the strengths that they bring to our educational systems and environments, and really tapping into those strengths and moving students forward by leveraging those strengths. I think it's really important. They all shared things that worked, and then those things that they struggled with. And I think Cassidy's point in regards to really that nurturing and that support that we know that teachers oftentimes provide our students really make a big difference in where students end up. We know that that's going to be especially important after what learners have just experienced and continue to experience. We know that's also the case with our educators that are working with learners. So I think it's just good for me personally to hear what learners have experienced pre-pandemic and how that has impacted. It validates some of what we're doing, but it also forces me to reflect on what more we need to do in the state of Arizona so that all learners and students that are moving through our system have a chance at making decisions, whether that be moving on to post-secondary or technical or into the real world and the workforce, but that we've done the best that we can to give them what they need to be successful in doing so.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think we talk a lot about accountability systems in education, and we think about testing and curriculum standards, but I actually think young people are probably the people, students are the best accountability. Robin, I'm going to invite you to weigh in, and then I have a couple questions around some of your state initiatives as well.
So really quick, one of the things that really struck me was something that Cassidy said, and it was that she felt like there were 100 students in her graduating class, and she felt like that the culture was to weed those students out. And I really believe that's how so many students feel. They feel like we're not there to, or that teachers aren't there to grow them and to ensure that they are successful and to look at their individual needs. And I feel like if you questioned our students and said, like, what do you feel like you need the most of? It would be that individualized support, no matter what the gender, the race, ethnicity, whatever. It would be that they thought their students cared. And, I talked about that we did that survey earlier, and we talked to SPED directors and we talked to principals and superintendents, and we interviewed parents and students. And the one thing that was evident in all the conversations that we had with the students was when they were successful, it was because they felt like an adult or a teacher or somebody in that building was invested in them. They had built that relationship and they really cared about their success. And so when Cassidy said that, I just immediately went back to those conversations because she said it felt like that was the culture, that they were to be weeded out. And so I just applaud all three of these students for the voice that they bring to the table to have these conversations about what the needs of our students are. They're so diverse, and we have got to get back to where we we supply and provide our teachers the needed professional development training and resources so that they can meet the individual needs of these students and prepare them for college or career, whichever one it is they choose. Our job is to prepare them for whatever that student deems as successful.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So I think Malachi and Ruby did a really incredible job of laying to bear the disparities and the action towards equity that this data shows we have not quite accomplished in this country. And what we see at the federal level, we know is really a buildup from the school level up. And Ruby and Malachi laid out pretty clearly, you know, we've been doing education for a while. We have an opportunity now to do it a little bit differently and think about how resources are used, how they're allocated. I want to invite, we'll sort of start with Robin, if that's okay. We have a lot of federal dollars going into the system right now. Can you share a little bit about sort of how you're working with districts or supporting leaders in using those funds and how you think about prioritizing use of those funds, particularly for students with disabilities?
Yeah, so one of the things that we realized quickly was there was great disparity in students' access to technology needed to participate in virtual instruction throughout the pandemic. And so the influx of funds have provided a great opportunity for us to level the playing field throughout the state for students to obtain devices and internet access. I mean, we even, once everybody went virtual with the pandemic, we actually had buses with hotspots on them that were parking out in front of neighborhoods because kids didn't have access to internet, nor did they have computers. So that the additional influx of funds allowed us the opportunity to level that playing field for the first time in Mississippi and ensure that our students had those devices. We also met with our districts and said, hey, we really need to, at this point, invest in some professional development and delivering related services virtually. That was a huge thing. We had students that were receiving OT, PT, language therapy, and all of a sudden that stopped because they had been doing it face to face. And so we worked on looking with different vendors and we host virtual office hours and we bring the vendors on so they can give a presentation to our district's special education directors so that they can make decisions about, hey, would this be something beneficial for my kids? The other thing was tracking. Like, districts really didn't have a tracking mechanism for virtual instruction like they did in the classroom. So we talked to our districts about really investing in that tracking system. So for us, it really pushed the envelope for us to offer virtual services and conferences. It gave us the money. So we were able to expand on the number of participants that were participating in our PD. We also were able to help the districts understand they could use those funds for remediation, learning loss, extended school year, and enrichment for kids. And, you know, the additional funding from the state and federal dollars created, I mean, it was amazing. But in some instances, you know, I talked about, when I talked to you Monday, Monica, I said, it's been difficult for districts to spend that money in the allotted time. And then as part of spending, they had to submit plans and applications for the money because we didn't just send them money. They had to submit a plan. So they were so quickly trying to meet the dates before the funds expired or before, you know, because we received some state dollars in addition to those federal dollars, that it potentially created a rushed and not so thoughtful planning sometimes for our districts. You know, at the SEA level, we weren't able to expand or execute our face-to-face professional development we had planned. You know, we had planned conferences face-to-face. We had speakers that were coming in. We had all of this scheduled. We had personnel that we were hiring with the funds to come in and support our academic issues. And then all of a sudden, we went to implement our plan for that. And ultimately, teachers weren't leaving positions or they were leaving the profession. or we had SEA, individuals at the SEA level that were leaving the state level jobs to be home with their families. So the influx of funds has really been great, but the pandemic really, has created some challenges with spending the funds that we were previously allocated.
And I know that we talked a little bit too about the differences in waivers from federal government in terms of when certain funds, specific funds, could be used.
Yeah, and that was something, because in our agency title was the Office of Federal Programs was getting additional waivers to spend that 19 money that's about to drop dead. And OSEP, we reached out to them and they said, I think it was based on maybe the CARES Funding Act when that money went into play. And they said, no, there will be no waiver for the Office of Special Education. And so that even made it more challenging. It kind of differentiated the spending stream, for us. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And Melissa, I wanted to give you a chance because I know that, Arizona's in a similar situation where there's a huge influx of dollars, and there's an opportunity or a confluence really of opportunities with the English learner population. So I wanted to invite you if there was sort of the plans around that.
So to Robin's point of the challenge of money, it was a great thing to get such big buckets of dollars, but it's also been a huge challenge, right? And something that we've struggled with historically in the world of education is really looking at things very long term and being really proactive versus reactive. And so that has been a huge issue with us at the state level and in looking at our LEAs, is that there is so much needed response to what's happened as a result of the pandemic that we are reacting very quickly. And then with the restrictions that come along with these big buckets of money, we're reinforcing that, right? Which is making it really difficult for LEAs to look at data to make really strategic and thoughtful decisions of investment of funds, and really looking not only at intensive investment of funds right now, infusing them in areas like EL programs where we've had some huge shifts and teachers are going to have to be prepared to meet the expectations around these shifts. Curriculums are going to have to be purchased. So this is all a great opportunity to do some of those things, but along with that, we need to look at what's going to need to be sustained, right? And that's going to be teacher recruitment and retention and ongoing preparation, changing of systems that ensure we identify students appropriately, assess them appropriately, and place them appropriately. There's so much that has to be thought of, and which has already been really difficult to do in education, and this has only made it more difficult. I also think that we had some huge inequities before the pandemic with these populations that we're talking about, especially today, our students with disabilities and our English language learners. It's not a surprise that the data for them continues to not be, where we need it to be. And those have only been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. My biggest concern, and what we're trying to really message and communicate very clearly, is that these groups of learners were already groups of children that needed intensive support and needed us to pay intensive attention to. And that, yes, the pandemic has affected every child sitting in a class. We can't say that there is not one student that hasn't been affected as a result of the pandemic, whether that's missed learning opportunities, right? Illness, trauma because family members have gotten sick or left us, and so on and so forth. So my biggest concern, hence why we're putting so much time and attention and messaging around this, is that now we're looking at, we hear a lot of, we now need to put things in place to help move all of our students forward, to help address the needs of all students, to close the gap in the learning loss that has occurred for all students. Yes, yes, and yes. However, those students that were already falling extremely behind before are falling behind even more. And we can't forget that. So when we talk about the use of funds at the state level, we talk about we needed technology for everyone. That was a big issue that came up for everyone. But then when we have areas like our rural areas or our high poverty areas that are made up of a lot of English learners, technology won't be enough, Monica. We also need to train parents that have never had technology in their households before. We have to ensure that the training is in a language that they all can understand. We have to ensure that students who are not only now learning technology, but learning how to use technology in a second language, which adds another layer of difficulty. So it wasn't enough to ensure everybody had a piece of technology in their hand. Now it was, what will those individual students who then have other things that we need to pay attention to, what will they need from educators to then utilize that technology? We know that our Hispanic students and our African-American students were hit the most by the pandemic, and especially in the state of Arizona. We've put dollars to adding 140 social workers and school counselors to our school systems. But again, we need to look at those areas that have never had counselors and now are not only going to need an additional counselor in their buildings, but they might need 2 or 3. And they need 2 or 3 that are prepared to not only work with students around trauma, but understand that the students they're working with are English learners, are students with disabilities, are students who are now homeless. So there's so many things that have to be considered that are very specific to certain subgroups and not just looked at as an overall picture.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think what I'm taking from that is a universal approach won't work because there are in fact groups of young people who need something more specific, more targeted. So I really appreciate that. And I want to thank Robin and Melissa, both of you, for joining and for your leadership for young people in your state, and for sharing some of the really compelling strategies and really suite of supports that you're providing. I'm going to go to Malachi next to help to close us out. Malachi, Cassidy, and Ruby. You've heard here in this session, and I'm sure you, given all your interests in the system and in inequities in the system, know that lots of adults are doing lots of things. And when I say adults, I really mean, like people in their 30s and older who are running these systems. They're doing lots of things. But what could they be doing differently right now to best meet the needs of young people? And so I just want to invite you to kind of blue sky, like what could they be doing differently right now to meet the needs of students in the K-12 system? You know what it looks like when you leave high school, so that young people are ready when we graduate from high school. Malachi, let's start with you.
I think one thing that needs to be done universally is to actually talk with your students. A lot of times, especially as you go higher into the grade levels, high school, if a student starts struggling, if a student isn't turning in work, then they are written off as lazy or as they don't care, when a lot of times it's more complicated than that. And those issues will never go addressed if someone's not willing to step up and say something. Putting that onus on a student who's 16 and not fully developed in being aware of themselves or how to communicate is a very big task. The other thing specifically to support students with disabilities, I would say that if you want to support your students, take it on yourself to educate yourself about disabilities. Obviously you can't look at every one, but even just some of the really common ones that you will see if you're teaching math, look at dyscalculia. What does that actually look like? What does that actually mean? Because a lot of times students with disabilities, again, are put onto this onus of having to educate their own teachers about their disability before they can even really access accommodations or have a conversation about what they need. And that's a lot of stress to put on a student who's already struggling and already pulled to their wits' end, juggling high school along with their own unique struggles.
Perfectly said. Ruby and Cassidy, I want to invite you also to respond.
I 100% agree with what Malachi said. I feel like you definitely need to talk to your students. I love when Miss Melissa said that some schools need 2 or 3 counselors, and I 100% agree with that, because I feel like my counselor wasn't necessarily prepared to deal with as many students as she had. Even though the school was kind of small, she had to schedule high school classes and college classes, and she didn't know a lot about the college classes. And I remember my senior year, I was like, you know, what other classes do I need to take? And she was like, oh, you could just take anything. And, you know, now transferring out to Ohio, those credits did transfer. However, I don't need them as far as my degree. So they're just credits sitting there. So I feel like definitely talk to your students. And research these learning disabilities, or research, you know, things that your students are telling you, because being a part of the leadership council with Malachi, I haven't, you know, there are learning disabilities that I haven't even heard of. You know, I knew about dyslexia, auditory processing, and the ones that, you know, some people know about, but dysgraphia and other things that I've heard, that there's like learning disabilities related just to reading and just to processing and just to math. You really have to research those things, and you want to be able to interact with your students. So I 100% agree with what Malachi said.
Yeah, I want to echo the whole like getting to know your students. I think that really helped me. I remember one teacher I had in high school. Her name was Ms. Vandenberg, so shout out to her. She was my math teacher, and she would always like let us know, like, if you are struggling, I will be here after school, regardless of like my commitments. Like, if I see that you're trying, you're not gonna fail this course. If you go above and beyond to like communicate with me, you will be getting the support you need. And if all my teachers were to tell me that, I would have felt 110% more comfortable to go to them. And like, in the areas that I am so insecure about, which is writing. For me, writing has always been super challenging. And I wish if my like writing teacher or English teacher would have given me that same space to go and ask for help, I probably would have gone. And just making sure to check in and just be, if you go to it, like if the teacher is at a school where it's predominantly like POCs, going out of your way to learn about their culture and their like, you know, behaviors and like norms would really help out. Because for me, seeing that like my white teacher was going out of her way to learn what like banda music is and like talking to me about it really made me feel like, oh wow, like she really understands like my culture, and like she's going out of her way, even though she doesn't have to. She's trying to start a conversation of like, hey, like, have you heard this song before? Or like, what did you do this weekend? And I'd be like, oh, I went to a carne asada, and she know what that is. I feel so much more comfortable to go to her and, you know, just be vulnerable and ask for the help that I needed. And so with that, I hope that educators go out of their way to really, like Cassidy and Malachi said, research what your student is like, and also just make it authentic. Because if you're being in it like fake it, I'm just gonna be like, wow, why are you like being fake? Why are you putting up this front? Just make it authentic, and you will see that authenticity will take you a long way. And I know if my teachers were more like that, I would have probably gotten the best out of my education and been.
Yeah, Ruby, thank you so much to all of you. The formal part of the panel is concluding. We do have a couple questions, so don't go anywhere. I just want to extend enormous gratitude to the 5 of you. I feel lucky that I got to work with you over this brief period of prep for this webinar. You're all incredible leaders. I also just want to say what Ruby just said about, you know, talking to students, and doing so authentically. I feel like you could replace students there with really just anyone, and that would be a true statement. I think that that's the way we probably need to be all working in the workplace, in our families. You know, be authentic, be yourself, get to know people, and then that is what you can use to forge an educational experience, a work experience, a college experience. So thank you so much for your wisdom and for sharing this time with us. Like I said, don't go anywhere. I'm going to start with, we do have a couple questions that have been coming in. Some have been answered in the Q&A function. So I just want to invite the full audience now, if you do have a question, to go ahead and put it in the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. I want to start with this question that came in for our state leaders. So for Robin and Melissa, what steps are being taken regarding curriculum or teaching practices to help high school students, especially from those from disadvantaged groups specifically, to reach the high school graduation milestone? So again, are there any specific curriculum or teaching practices to help these groups reach the graduation milestone? Melissa?
Well, so I can say in our unique populations unit, something that's happening specifically with our migrant students is that we're working really closely with LEAs that have high number of migrant students to kind of reconfigure how they have access and opportunity to the coursework that they need to graduate from high school. That group in particular, many of them, a large number, were impacted by the pandemic in that their parents either were sick or were unable to work, and they were charged with taking on employment to help support their families. So it's not that there's necessarily a change in curriculum, but there's getting LEAs to think about how they can give access and opportunity to coursework that needs to be taken so that these students who are having to continue to work to help support their family are able to also attain their high school diploma, because many of them want to go beyond high school and they'll need that to do that. As far as our English learners, there's been a lot of training around pedagogy. So again, we don't develop curriculum. We don't advocate for any curriculum, but what we do work on is pedagogy that's very specific to the type of learners the type of learners that the educators we work with are responsible for.
I'll just say in Mississippi, we developed some teacher resource guides, and we also have a scaffolding document that is great. So as they're working toward those standards, if they're not able to master that grade level standard, they can look at the standard below that and look at like what that requires. And so they can work on that so they can scaffold until they can actually master that standard. And we've done a lot of training around with our teachers, just lots of professional development about how to utilize that scaffolding document. The other thing is we developed some family guides for student success. And so we only have them available in K-8 right now, but they were guides that we created. And what we found is there was a lot of confusion, even with our teachers, in understanding what the standard actually meant and how they could demonstrate mastery of that standard. So we wrote them in a very family-friendly terms, like, this is what the standard says, this is what it really means, and here's some activities you can do at home to help your child master this standard. And then we even did trainings with our administrators, and we developed little kits to pass out to say, here, like when your parents comes for their family conference, sit down with them if their kids are struggling and give them these books and give them these packets with these manipulatives so they can work with their child. The other thing is, and it kind of goes back, I think, to what Malachi said about the students with disabilities and not having to explain what your disability is. We just released last week family guides for students with disabilities, and we took all the 13 categories and we, have the vocabulary in there, like what is that disability? We define it, resources and direct links that you can go to find supports for your child. So it's just an inclusive document, 13 different ones, and we also developed a 14th one on SCD. And so we really are trying to provide supports for our families, and the teachers can use those supports as well in the classroom to help develop and support the students with disabilities, or any student, again, that's struggling in the classroom, because what we know, sometimes those students that have not been identified with a disability or have some other reason, they're struggling as well. So
thanks, Robin and Melissa. I know we're coming up on time. I want to pose this one other question we have for Ruby, Cassidy, and Malachi. We might have time for, we have about 5 minutes left, but here we go. Actually, I think we only have about 2 or 3 minutes left because we do want to kick it over to Matt for closing. Sorry, y'all. I'm so engrossed and then I look at the time. The question is this: if you could develop a high school program to support the concept of, quote, rise out, don't drop out, for those who need help, what should be changed in high school to focus or offer support to students who need the most support?
I think a big thing that needs to be changed in order to offer support is to help create an open space for teachers and students to communicate, because there is that authority figure dynamic there. It can be difficult to talk openly about what's happening and to actually purposefully make a space that encourages open dialogue and encourages teachers to listen to their students as equals and not as people they have authority over, would be the first step in anything that's trying to support these students.
Malachi took the words right out of my mouth. I feel like there definitely needs to be an open dialogue between teachers and students, and even inputting counselors in there, just so you guys can all have a realization of what your future is looking like. How are you doing with your grades? How are you feeling at home? Just a sense of feeling like nurtured and like someone's there for you, and that you're not the only one going through this process.
Awesome. Ruby, you might have the last word here.
Yeah, so quickly, just to add on to what Malachi and Cassidy say, I agree. I also think like offering tutoring would be great. I just think back to when I was in elementary school, and my elementary school, again, majority Latinx students, English language learners, we were like the lowest like state test scores, and so they offered free tutoring for us, and I think that genuinely helped a lot. One, because it gave parents the opportunity to have their kids be after school and not have to pay for like daycare, but then at the same time they were getting like that extra help and education, and I think putting that throughout like high school would help with me. And I know if my friends and I had a space to go to get tutoring help, we would like see it as like a hangout time, but also a time to get like my studies in. And so just making a space like that. I remember my high school did cocoa and cram during finals week, and we just had hot chocolate and like the teachers there to help us out. So just creating little events like that.
I love this. You've really highlighted how learning and our school experiences requires that social and emotional piece. So thank you for making that so clear. Thanks again for all your wisdom. It's been a gift to all of us. And there are so many good nuggets in there too, the way you even challenge the role of standardized testing, the way you're challenging in state education agencies, what the types of supports you offer. So thank you to all of you. I'm gonna hand it over to my colleague, Matt, to close us out.
Thank you, Monica, for that great discussion. And thank you, Ruby, Cassie, Malachi, Robin, and Melissa for sharing your wisdom and time with us today. That was so incredible. I'm Matt Atwell. I'm a senior researcher at Civic, and I'm the lead author of this year's Building a Grad Nation report. The 2021 BGN report is the 6th I've been a part of, and what always gives me so much hope is the lessons we learn year after year. We've learned so much more about what we need to do to support students and the evidence base for what support schools and districts should be implementing. We've learned that we need to support students holistically, not just academically, but social, emotionally. We heard the importance of extracurriculars like arts to nourish the whole person. We are better able to understand where students are falling off track and important differences across types of schools and states, the data that Bob and Bridge were sharing earlier today. We've learned that high school is not an endpoint, but an on-track indicator to future success. We heard from 3 superstar students about what we should be doing to ensure schools are preparing students for college, career, and future lives. At the beginning of this event, Bridge dedicated it to Roger Weisberg, who is one of the co-founders of the Collaboration for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, and shared so much scholarship over the years. I always think of Roger as the great collaborator. It was almost impossible to join a meeting with him and not hear him use that word collaboration. In closing, let's take that lesson from Roger, because we are stronger together. Educators, practitioners, researchers, students, families. Collaborating together is how we meet this moment and build a grad nation for all students. So I just want to thank everyone for joining this event. AT&T, and Allstate for making it possible. Our remarkable panel and the panelists, our partners on the Grad Nation campaign at APA, and Everyone Graduates Center, Amanda Martirano and Vaughn Burns, people who make this event possible, our partners at the Alliance for Excellent Education. Please continue this conversation using the hashtag GradNation. You can find the report and your state's data profile by going to the Grad Nation website, and Ellie dropped those links in the chat. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email gradnation90@americaspromise.org. Thank you all so much for joining today.